Good evening and welcome to this Institute for Government event to discuss how the government can provide certainty over its investment plans. I'm Ollie Bartram, a senior economist at the Institute for Government, and am chairing today's event, which we're delighted to be partnering with Waits Group on. So it is often said that more or better infrastructure spending will help to deliver objectives that are held across the political spectrum, including boosting overall economic growth, reducing regional inequalities in growth, and achieving net zero. Yet the government's plans for capital projects have repeatedly shifted over the last decade. Budgets have been cut, then boosted, and now retrenchment is planned again. And major projects such as HS2 have been subject to major revisions in budget and in scope. The 5-year National Infrastructure Plan and National Infrastructure and Construction Pipeline only apply to some projects and are still subject to change. So this makes it difficult for the construction sector to plan. That increases costs and means capital budgets don't go so far. So today we're going to explore what the benefits of and barriers to a longer term and more stable project pipeline are. And to discuss this, I'm delighted to be joined by an excellent panel. On my right, we have Avashi Parashar, Chief Impact Officer and Chief Economist at the UK Infrastructure Bank. She also previously led analysis for the Levelling Up White Paper. On the screen, joining us from Parliament in between votes on the migration bill, we have Bill Esterson, who is Shadow Minister for Business and Industry. We have Steve Beachy, Group Public Sector Director at Waits Group, and Sir John Armitt, Chair of the National Infrastructure Commission. So we will be live tweeting this event from the account IFG Events using the hashtag IFG Infrastructure. So please follow along and tweet your own thoughts if you have any, or whatever the Twitter alternatives are now, threads. And for those who are watching online, you can submit your questions via Slido. We'll come to audience questions from about 40 minutes in. Those in the room, start thinking now about what you want to ask. So I think that's more than enough from me. So John, I'd like to come to you first to help us set the scene a bit. The NIC put out a fantastic report earlier this year setting out the UK's progress, or perhaps lack of progress, on infrastructure. I mean, the main message that I got from it was that government has set out ambitious goals for infrastructure, but is off track to deliver them. So what factors are driving that, and how in particular does certainty and stability fit into it?
Well, I suppose it's probably, we shouldn't be surprised that governments, ministers like to make ambitious statements. That's what people want to hear, that things are going to get a lot better, that we're, for example, going to have 40 new hospitals in the next 10 years, etc. But the difficulty, I think, is that ambition is difficult to match with delivery. Who is responsible for delivery? And I think one of the difficulties we have is that government departments support the minister in creating the ambitious policy, but there's not a great deal then behind that when it comes to ownership of that policy and the ability to drive that policy. There's a great difference between making policy and actually doing the sort of rather more difficult day job of driving relentlessly delivery. The two things are entirely different, and I would argue that, to be fair, that's not what most people join the civil service to do. And of course, it's not what ministers actually want to be a minister for, or what they're expected to be a minister for when they're appointed. You know, how many column inches are you going to get, chum, in the next 6 months to sort of support the party and the Prime Minister? How are you going to demonstrate you're making a difference? Well, you make a difference by going off and making a new policy about something that the previous guy who was there for 18 months made a policy about 18 months ago. I mean, I'm being slightly cynical, but I think it is a difficulty of the process. And I'm not saying, you know, there is, that's democracy in a sense. I'm not saying there is some very easy alternative. But it does put you then in that difficult position. I mean, if I go back to 2018, and we made a recommendation then that in order to make our homes across the country energy efficient, we needed 20,000 installations a week over the next sort of 10 years. And we've not seen anything like that. In fact, we've seen a decline in the number of installations. Why? Well, because the detailed sort of incentives and arrangements to deliver that have just not been put in place. We've seen a slower rollout of EV charging points than is necessary to sustain the shift to EVs, so that by 2030 it's realistic to say, well, there aren't going to be any petrol or diesel cars for sale. We've seen certainly a very slow take-up, for example, on heat pumps, 40,000 a year. France installs 300,000 a year. So what is France getting right that we're not getting right in being able to incentivize people to make these sort of changes? The government has a target of, 600,000 a year by 2028. I mean, we're at 40,000. Yet the target is 600,000. And it's very evident that the current approach doesn't work. But then it comes back to, well, how is government and what are the restraints on government finance? Because this is largely about subsidy. Or you make dramatic differences in the price of gas or electricity. These are really tricky questions and challenging ones, but it's, unless you're prepared to address them, then you're not going to meet that sort of ambitious objective that you set out. On the other hand, the rollout of fibre has gone very well, and I would argue that some of the meetings I've been at, where you've had industry, department, regulator, all sitting around the table saying, well, what are our blockers? What have we got to do to overcome the blockers here? It's been very, very strong, and an example of what can happen when you get everybody pulling together. I think we also have to remember that the majority of our economic infrastructure is actually provided by the private sector. It's government does road, rail and flood defences. The rest comes from the private sector. So how are you going to get the private sector to invest? Well, you're not going to get them to invest if there's uncertainty around policy, or if it changes every so often, or if we can't make a decision for the next 5 years. I mean, in 18, we said you need to be in a position to make a decision on hydrogen by 23 at the latest. Now it's 2026. Will a decision be made by 2026? Well, your guess is as good as mine. Ideally, it needs to be made sooner if we're to actually see confidence in either hydrogen or the rollout of heat pumps. But as long as you've got that indecision, and one appearing easier than the other, and possibly believing that it might be less disruptive, I'm not sure it will be, but hydrogen tends to be seen as, oh, that must be easy. And so why would I make a decision to do anything else beforehand? So I think having the delivery mechanisms following on from the ambition is essential, and having the policies which give the private sector the confidence that they can go and invest. Whereas if you're chopping and changing your mind all the time, then the private sector is going to find it very difficult to follow on. So I think my summary at the moment would be, yes, great to have a lot of policies around and a lot of ambitious targets, but they're not worth the paper they're written on if you haven't actually got the right mechanisms which are going to ensure delivery to follow on.
Excellent. Thanks very much, John. And I think that leads us very nicely to Steve. So Waits does a lot of work across the public sector, delivering a wide range of projects at scale. I believe you did the UK's first net zero schools, prisons, social housing, lots of other stuff. So John just mentioned the importance of giving the private sector the confidence that it needs to help us meet our infrastructure ambitions. What would you like to see change in the way that the government plans and delivers its infrastructure projects?
Okay, thanks, Ollie. And thank you to the IFG for hosting this event. I think this is a really, really important discussion that we're really delighted to be part of. Just in terms of the Waits Group, thank you for that introduction. Just a couple of other things I'd like to highlight. We are one of the UK's largest family-owned construction businesses, working across residential and property services and also construction. And we began 126 years ago as a house builder in Croydon. So we've grown a lot since then across the UK. And we've got a great deal of experience working on large-scale projects and also smaller-scale projects with central and local government. And we've worked with all sorts of clients, including the DFE, the MOJ, the MOD, and 154 local authorities, which I was quite surprised. That's over half of the local authorities in the UK. And we're also, as Ollie mentioned, working on net zero schools, net zero housing, net zero prisons, a whole host of different types of infrastructure around net zero. The other thing I wanted to mention as well is actually we're involved in the first gigafactory up in Washington for Envision, which is a £1 billion partnership between Nissan UK and Sunderland City Council. And it's the next generation of electric vehicle batteries that will be 30% more effective and efficient, and will provide 10,000 batteries to cars every year. So it's a huge investment, really, really important about the future direction of our country, and it will provide 4,500 jobs permanently for the area, high quality jobs. So really, really important, and the sort of infrastructure that we need. In terms of, we're committed to really investing in the UK construction industry around the skills and modern methods of construction. For example, we've built a factory in Coventry, a 68,000 square foot factory, to produce mechanical and electrical components. These are sort of prefabricated modular kits to put into all sorts of buildings, and we find that's really efficient and is sort of the direction of travel we need to go in terms of making our industry more effective and efficient. At the moment, the industry, I don't think there's enough sufficient certainty from the government in terms of future pipeline. That's one of the issues that we need to make those sorts of investments. There's some investment we've made in Coventry, really, really important, but we need long-term commitments to enable us to take that risk and create those sorts of facilities. In real terms, this means that we are not able to make the training decisions as well for the next generation of workers that's going to meet our country's ambitions. It prevents us making major investment decisions to build the sorts of factories that I mentioned, and really driving things on. One simple way the government could drive growth would be to provide construction industry with that longer-term pipeline, and obviously when we discuss that here today. Interestingly, we haven't actually had a pipeline from the IPA since 2021. Now, there are a number of reasons for that, change of government and all sorts of other issues, changes within the government and all sorts of other things, but it's not helpful, and it's something we really need to address. But we also need it to be a 5 to 10 year look, not just a short-term look at what's coming in the next year or two. That's not really going to help us really make a difference. And we'd also like to see a more strategic approach to planning. That is another huge issue that is holding us back in terms of being able to take investment decisions and drive things on. And most of the projects that we're involved in are held up in planning in one form or another, which is really, really making it difficult for us to drive things on. And then the final point I would make really is about this issue around really generating this workforce for the future. In the construction industry, 40% of the construction population retires in the next 10 years. We desperately, desperately need to get new people, young people engaged in the industry to make it fit for tomorrow. And that is a hugely important challenge for us.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Steve. Lots there to unpack in further discussion. Bill, if I could come to you next. I guess we've heard a lot about the problems that we have so far. If I could focus on one of them in particular, we know from the work of John and colleagues at the NIC and also Climate Change Committee that current government is off track to deliver its net zero targets. Labour's are even more ambitious, so you want to decarbonise the energy system by 2030. I mean, what would a Labour government do, potentially with 5 years or less to go to reach that target, to help really get things going and get things built, both in the energy sector, but also to address some of the other wider problems that we've heard about in delivering infrastructure?
Well, thank you very much, Ollie, and sorry I'm not able to be there this evening. The bell may go at any time, which I'll have to rush off again, but hopefully not for a few minutes. And look, it's great to join the panel. I was reflecting on a couple of things that John Stevens said already, actually. One of the 40 supposed new hospitals supposedly was built in my constituency. It looks suspiciously like a new department at an existing hospital. And in fact, that is exactly what it is. It's not a new hospital at all, which is the overreaching claims of government. I think John was setting those out, and I aspire to do rather better if I become a minister sometime next year. It's great to see Steve. So Steve showed me around the site where the new Merseyside Fire and Rescue Service headquarters and National Resilience Centre is being built just down the road from my constituency a couple of months ago, and very, very impressive, the approach that Waits are taking. And a really good example of how the private sector has so much to offer and why it is so important that government partners with the private sector. And just as something that John said that really did strike a chord with me, the example with fibre, industry, department and regulator sitting down and working out the answers together is exactly what Labour proposes to do through an industrial strategy. I was really heartened to read in the FT a few months ago now, I think it was, that a joint article between Greg Clark, Vince Cable and Peter Mandelson making exactly this point, that you have to have that partnership. It is what successful modern economies do, and ultimately I think the success for Labour, as much as anything, will come if at the end of our first term in office we have demonstrated the value of that partnership to such a degree that it is unremarkable, it has consensus support, and that it survives not just across different parliaments, but regardless of who is in office. And that is one of our objectives, I think, if we are to succeed, to end that uncertainty, to end the market difficulties that have been exacerbated by the mini budget in September, but actually were really the culmination of a long period of uncertainty and constant changes of direction and decision, and actually more than that, a lack of decision making. There's a 15-year pipeline for new wind farm projects to be connected to the grid. I mean, we're clearly going to have to do rather better than that to answer your question and hit a 2030 target. But ultimately, speeding up decision making in the public sector is critical for the private sector to play its part. And one of the ways that we will deliver to this agenda is that we've outlined what we've described as missions, 5 missions, and it is that, to your point about clean energy. We have a clean energy superpower mission to hit that 2030 target. It will involve the whole of government. It will, rather in the way that the vaccine task force was able to cut across different departments, rather in the way that John outlined the way that Fiverr is implemented, it will require a very large degree of cooperation and joint working, whether that's across government, between government and the private sector and the investment community, and actually a combination of those factors. So that is the key approach. But fundamentally, we have to deliver confidence in the markets. We have to turn around the record low level of business investment in this country, and massively so, to crowd in the private investment on the scale that is needed to deliver the capacity that is implied, or is explicit, in fact, in our targets. So that is the plan. It is challenging. You're absolutely right about that, Ollie. But actually, if we are going to hit one of our other missions of sustaining the highest growth in the G7, this is how we do it. We create the jobs, we create the prosperity, we create the growth, and it will happen by being ambitious, by removing the barriers, and by working closely with the private sector. And one of the things that I spend my time doing is talking to people like Steve around the country, learning what works, what is effective in delivery, what are the changes that are needed, so that an incoming Labour government is ready on day one to implement the changes with the support, with the relationships of people in the business community, so that we can succeed together.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Bill. And thanks again for joining us during the votes. Hopefully you'll be able to stay with us for a bit, but obviously no worries if the bell goes. So Bill mentioned crowding in private investment there, Vashi, and we've heard a lot about private investment so far private sector investment so far from all of the panelists. I mean, part of it is sort of in the context of giving the private sector confidence. But another thing the government often worries about is whether it's simply displacing private investment. And that's, often a reason for not making significant investments with public money. Now, I know it's something that you've done a lot of thinking about, working on UKIB's sort of strategy for additionality and where, you can really make change. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you for having me. And I'll give a quick bit of context about the UK Infrastructure Bank. So we are a government-owned policy bank, and we were set up 2 years ago. Exactly. We celebrated our 2-year anniversary last month. And we were set up with a very clear mandate that we must deploy £22 billion of capital in partnership with the private sector and the public sector in service of 2 strategic objectives: to support the net zero transition and on regional and local economic growth. Both clearly very urgent, important, and defining missions in the forthcoming decades. And as many of the analysis from DESNES and CCC has shown, the public sector can't do it alone, because the size of the investments required, the additional capital on net zero, for example, is 50 to 70 billion a year. So I wanted to make a couple of points on your additionality and displacement argument, which is, the first one is that additionality is hardwired into how we select our projects, and how we deploy capital, and how we solve problems as an institution. It's within our operating principle, and we have to not just make a positive financial return, but we have to demonstrate additionality and crowd in and mobilize private capital. But we look at additionality from very first principles, and that is what our additionality approach that was published last year showed, that we look at the barriers and the market failures that we are here to solve. We look at what would happen if we didn't support a particular sector or a project. would we go in to scale up new technologies? Would we go in to commercialize new business models? Or are we going in to facilitate new investors where the investor market is not as matured? Which of these are we doing? And we have 5 priority sectors as well. So we operate within these very clear parameters, and I think that sort of gives us the independence to lay out our stall and to test where we would invest, how we would invest, and where we would add value. And I would say, much of what we do and what we are going to be doing is in the transformational infrastructure space. And in that space, displacement could be a red herring, because we are looking at displacing lower value added with higher value added. We're trying to create green infrastructure from high carbon intensive infrastructure. And we are quite aware that we have to capture the added value there and not simply get bogged down by the crowding out argument. Although, as I said, because it's built within our operating principles, every investment we make, and we are being very transparent about it. If you go to our website, you'll see that all of our investments so far, we are publishing fact sheets which clearly say why we've gone in and invested, and how much capital have we mobilized.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So going to get into a couple of issues with the panel, but just another reminder for those in the room to start thinking about questions now, and those online to continue sending them in. Thanks to those who have already, including the one that arrived at 9 a.m. Some people are very keen. I wondered if we could actually, it's come up quite a few times, so I wondered if we could turn to planning. Steve, you mentioned that it's one of the big barriers that sort of Waits faces. Yeah. And Sir John, I know it's something that featured heavily in your progress report. So maybe you could kick us off with what the issues are, but also if anyone has any ideas on what the solutions should be, because obviously this is I think for technocrats, it's a very simple, easy thing to solve. But for people like Bill, who have to deal with the political consequences of it, it's extremely tricky.
Well, we were actually asked by Treasury, it must be 9 months ago now, I think, to do a study on planning when it started to bubble up as being an issue. And one of the first things was to sort of look at it historically. And what you get from that is that in 2010, 2012, sort of it first came in 2008, got modified in 2010, the whole NCIPS regime. It was taking about 2.5 years to get through to conclusions by the inspector and passing it on to the minister for a decision. And now it's over 4 years. So in 10 years, we've seen a 60% increase in the time it takes. Even more scary, I think, is the fact that we've gone from 10% of projects being judicially reviewed to 58% of projects being judicially reviewed. Now, judicial review is a disaster at the end of the day, because it inevitably is going to add at least 18 months, if not more, onto the time frame of what was meant to be a decision, and then that decision gets judicially reviewed. So the background is poor. We made a number of recommendations, first of which was that the government needed to update the national policy statements, because without a clear national policy statement, the inspector is left almost making up policy by himself, because he hasn't got clear direction from government as to what is of national interest, what therefore a project automatically, in a sense, is necessary. Now let's see what are the things which are causing concern about this project and how are those going to be mitigated, what is the promoter proposing to do, so that makes this project more acceptable. But the fundamentals that this is a project which fulfills national policy has to be the starting point. And if you haven't got a national policy statement, and the energy one hasn't been updated since 2010, then who's left to sort of discern that? And of course, the poor old inspector finishes up trying to discern what is policy. We then said those should be updated every 5 years and kept fresh, if you like, to reflect anything else which government had decided in the interim. The other thing you discover is that environmental assessments are made on projects which can be relatively adjacent, but you start from square one on an environmental assessment and mitigation. So we're not carrying forward and we're not learning from what has already been done. Great work for consultants, but not very good for getting projects moved along quickly. We've also said that there needs to be more pressure from the centre. So actually, at the end of the day, what drives things? Well, it's attention from either Treasury or Number 10. So let's have a unit at the centre which is monitoring progress on these applications and geeing people up if they're not moving quickly enough. And then finally, let's be willing to use a bit more incentive to help people come to terms with these schemes. They may not be the direct beneficiary. And classic at the moment is the power lines which are necessary to reinforce the grid across the country, which is getting a lot of attention in the last few days. Well, therefore, think about should those people who are living under these power lines and putting up with the impact of them getting their electricity for 10% less or whatever figure you might discern. But let's look at how we can make it easier for people who are on the receiving end of these infrastructure impacts to actually come to terms with them. So those are some of the ideas which we came forward with. But I mean, to the point that was made earlier on, I mean, it is everywhere you go. It's not just in economic infrastructure, it's in social infrastructure, it's in housing. Everywhere you go at the moment, planning is one of the biggest difficulties. Apparently people don't want to go into the planning profession. I mean, a developer will pay the local authority to go and hire some consultants to actually look at his planning application. Now, that might sound to be a bit of a vested interest in that. But I mean, the fact that developers are having to pay local authorities to go and recruit some people to actually look at their planning application says it all.
Thanks very much. Steve, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with everything John said, and everything, I'm experiencing exactly the same issues that you've talked about, and that 58% figure on judicial review absolutely supports our own experience. It's wrong, quite frankly, the situation we have, because it's just holding up economic growth. For every pound that's spent in the construction industry, it has an impact, a multiplier effect of £2.92. So it's a hugely important engine for growing our economy. And yet it's just at the moment spinning its wheels. We cannot get the projects through. Now that's also costing us as taxpayers lots of money because it increases the overhead for the contractors and the supply chain because of all these delays and all these people who are working hard and trying to get these projects through. It's not an efficient way to do business on a world platform where we're competing with all these countries around the world. They haven't got these sort of problems. Do you think China's sat there waiting for planning approval, over 3 years to get a scheme ahead? Of course they're not. They're just moving on with it. Now, I'm not saying that's the right thing for us, of course not. But we need to get the balance right. And I think that the government did have the planning bill, but that got abandoned due to political pressure following the by-election result. So that was obviously something that was on the agenda, and it's really, really important that is back on the agenda again. We really do need these assets. We've got a housing crisis that is being made hugely worse by planning problems. We've got assets like prisons that we desperately need. Prison places, we're nearly at 100% capacity with the prisons, and yet they're all delayed in hugely expensive and problematic planning delays. And it doesn't seem right, and it's something we really, really need to address.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Bill, I don't know if you want to come in on the issue of planning and whether Labour would change anything about how the system works if they were to come in.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think we have to speed things up dramatically if we're going to make the kind of progress that we were talking about earlier. And I mean, one area is ending the moratorium on onshore wind, so that it can get consent, which is the cheapest form of renewable electricity generation. But more widely, I think John's points are very well made as ever. There is a skill shortage, and we have to address it. We have to be prepared to recruit potentially from overseas in the short term, but certainly invest in skills development, in planning. But we've got to do that across the piece. We've got 1 million vacancies in this country. There's a much wider point here around construction and infrastructure. But we've got to reverse the hollowing out of planning departments that's been a consequence of local government cuts, and planning departments have suffered some of the biggest cuts around the country, and that is a very significant contributor to planning delays. There just hasn't been the capacity there to deal with planning applications. But absolutely, we have to do this. And just I like John's point about there being benefits for communities affected by large infrastructure projects. I think in general terms, there need to be benefits for people who are affected by planning decisions. But there's a wider point around transition to low carbon. We've got to take people with us. So far, there isn't the sense of immediacy about the impact of the climate emergency, even though the three hottest days ever were last week in the world. There's no sense of immediacy because it hasn't affected people in this country, for example, because we happen to have the Gulf Stream was in a place that meant we didn't experience those ultra high temperatures. We've got to offer people incentives to benefit from the transition, and this is true of planning. It's true of jobs transitions. It's true of lower bills for energy. It's true of benefiting in transport terms when we move away from petrol and diesel in our private cars. Some of which, by the way, is about public transport and really good quality public transport, more universally available, London-style system as widely as possible, as much as it is about making electric cars available. But I know I've moved away from planning, but I think a lot of these things are linked.
Excellent. Thanks very much. So I'm going to start sort of drifting into audience questions now, largely because someone online has posed the question I was going to ask better than I did. So thanks to Jeff White. And his question is on essentially the links between central government's infrastructure strategies and local governments. There's lots and lots of issues here, and panellists can choose which angle they want to take on it. But obviously, levelling up is one of the objectives that politicians often want to achieve with infrastructure investment. At the same time, we have a huge debate about devolution and how much to devolve. There's an interesting question there about whether you can improve the certainty and stability of the project pipeline by devolving down to local governments, who tend to have a bit of a longer term view. There are also a number of other questions just about how you get that local voice into central planning more effectively. Now, Avashee, maybe I can start with you, because you've got a great history with levelling up, having led the analysis for the white paper. Now at UKIB, one of your strategic focuses is levelling up. Mm-hmm. I mean, how do you make sure that that local voice is reflected in the decisions that you make?
So I think just putting my old levelling up hat on, I'd just like to remind people that one of the significant features of the white paper was how we thought about levelling up, or how we thought about, spatial disparities and how to solve the problems. And that is to look at it in a holistic systems way. And we said that there is not one single capital you should be thinking of, and you should be thinking about the place from bottom up and think about what the place needs rather than a one-size-fits-all. It's a very different way of solving problems of a place, rather than saying, I'm going to take a helicopter view and look at all the places, and every place needs X, Y, and Z. And it's basically what the white paper was saying was rewiring of a mindset of how we resolve spatial disparities. And when I started my current role, it became even more apparent because, I'm in the coalface, part of making decisions about where and how the capital will be deployed. And it's very clear that infrastructure is a huge multiplier in the levelling up context. But it's part of a bigger ecosystem, and we've got to look at that ecosystem. And if you saw the green finance strategy, there were some very neat pictures of where the different institutions fitted in. You had, government, UKRI, British Business Bank, us, and the private sector. And I think, having that rewired mindset and looking at what a place needs, infrastructure being a key part of that, but taking a more systems approach to how infrastructure investment fits in with what you were saying earlier about skills, workforce planning. We just revealed how all these issues are interconnected. And, these are hard, wicked problems, but, we have to start solving them. So the way we are doing it in the bank is exactly that. So our impact framework that we published clearly, and we are operationalizing it in our decision making, that when we shape and deliver our deals, we are very much looking at all these wider, aspects. And we are also looking at the intersectionality between net zero and regional and local economic growth. Because, you can't look at them separately. You simply cannot. And you would be doing disservice to either of those benefits if you did look at them separately. And that's what we are trying to do.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Vashi. I don't know if anyone else wanted to come in on this topic. Steve, potentially, I know you've written about it.
Yes, thank you. I had the privilege to be involved in the LGA's inquiry into levelling up locally. And it's really interesting, actually, because there's some really important key findings. One was that the UK's fiscal system is a real hindrance to growth locally. And fiscal devolution is something that should be seriously considered. Funding streams and grant structures need a little more long-term focus to them. There's another key finding. They're too short-term. That actually makes it more difficult for communities to use them and become effective. And then the political cycles and short-term budgets make it quite difficult to build trust with communities and allow projects to flow through. So there was a number of different findings that we sort of resulted in. And I think the other thing we were looking at was how different countries are doing. And one of the things is that Germany, they have a philosophy of economic development. So they invest 5 times more than the UK every year in economic development, which they then distribute sort of regionally. And that has resulted in a much better situation they've got in terms of their regional growth, and there's less of an issue in terms of that disparity. So there are some key things really that we need to look at, and it's really important that we do that.
Excellent. So John, Bill, I'm aware that you will probably have some points to land on levelling up, but I'm going to take a couple more questions from the audience, and then you can choose what you want to address. So if anyone in the room has anything they want to ask, please raise your hand. We have some roving mics coming around the room. Gentleman over there in the blue jacket.
Barney, White Spunner. I mean, one of the issues on planning, which strikes me as something I've been involved in, is I'm not certain that councils really know what they can do and what they can't do. And I think quite often you find there's tension between planning committees and officials. And there isn't actually a sort of clear set of guidelines. And I really like the idea, I think, Sir John, you mentioned having a sort of a central policing, if you like, of that. But I think it really needs maybe a new government could have a forensic look at actually what the powers of planning committees are and where a planning committee can overturn or short-circuit some of the issues that officials raise and some of the issues that are raised by peripheral bodies. And now I say it, I'll probably be attacked by every bat lover in the country, but I mean an awful lot of the rural developments in this country which are being held up by bat surveys at enormous cost are completely ludicrous. So I think there's a real case for having a detailed look at what council planning committees' powers are.
Excellent, thanks very much. I'm going to take one from online as well, which links to something that we were all discussing before we got on stage, actually. Which is about, I guess, the government's risk appetite. So the type of cost-benefit analysis we usually do might not, well, I guess there are two related issues. One, economic cost-benefit analysis might not reveal the true benefits of transformational projects. And the other one that's probably linked to that is the government is quite averse to taking risks and to investing a lot of money in a project that goes wrong. And Colin Megson, I think, has asked a question about a specific example of this, which is using hydrogen to deliver carbon-free grid electricity, which is an example that we touched on before. So 3 topics. We've got the levelling up topic from earlier in devolution. We have the question from the audience on what powers committees actually have in the context of planning, particularly whether they can resolve the bat survey issue, and the question on government's risk appetite, particularly in the context of net zero. If you want to come to any or all of those, Sir John, the floor is yours.
Well, taking the devolution issue first, we've, for several years now, basically argued for greater devolution, and particularly financial devolution. And then you can get on to local tax raising or money raising, fiscal devolution, and enabling local authorities to raise their own money, which is another issue. But in the first place, I think government has to stop having these competitions for money all the time and to be far more prepared to actually, almost on a spatial basis, say, look, these are areas where we are going. They've started to do it, to be fair, with West Midlands and Greater Manchester recently, who've got 5-yearly settlements and the promise of further 5-yearly settlements. That needs to be rolled out across a much greater number of local authorities. They're best, coming to the point of bottom up, they're the best people to actually understand the local community, what is needed, what they're going to be responsible for and accountable for to their electorate for what happens in their town or city. People down here shouldn't be responsible for what happens in regional cities and towns. They don't have that sense of ownership for a start. It's all done in a theoretical basis rather than a real sense of ownership about somebody feeling accountable to their citizens and their voters. And I would like to see them in the same situation as the regulated utilities, where every 5 years they get a settlement, and they know they're going to get another one in 5 years' time, and so they have that ability to look forward and plan on that basis. They need to be also, of course, they can't do that without the skills. And it's a vicious circle. If you're not being given the responsibility to do things, then nobody's going to want to work for you. If, in fact, people can see that things are really happening at a local level and there's an opportunity to be involved in something and probably seeing it being delivered a lot quicker than if you're involved in something at a national level, then good people working in local authorities being part of that will become a lot more attractive. Because without those people, they're going to really struggle to plan and understand what their opportunities are. So I think devolution is absolutely critical, but it's got to be with money attached and the opportunity ultimately to be able to raise money, because at the moment it's 90% comes from the centre and 10% is local, which is just ridiculous. And of course the strength of Germany is the Länder the Lander approach and the fact that it is much more regionalised, and therefore people have that local identity. They invest in local banks. The local banks and the colleges might decide what the education needs are going to be. It's much more locally approached in Germany. I could go on a lot longer, but I'll let other people some of the...
Thanks very much. Bill, I wondered if I could come to you next. Just a reminder, we're talking about lots of things. Levelling up, risk appetite, and clarity over when planning decisions can be overruled.
Yeah, our industrial strategy specifies the importance of investment in the regions and of devolving decision-making and resources to do so. It's an inherent part of how we grow the economy effectively across the country. So this is very much the agenda that we want to adopt, and we've got to. There's so much. I mean, my 13 plus years in Parliament, and it was going on long before I got here. Decision making is made far too often on the basis of what works in London and the immediate southeast, and the needs of the rest of the country are not considered. So this point about decentralisation, devolution is very, very well made and will be fundamental to how we operate as a government if we are indeed to get there. And I'll just talk a bit about I think the point about risk appetite. And we saw the frustration, right, for many people when Labour left office in 2010. The offshore wind industry in this country was leading the world. We've expanded it significantly, but we're now third or fourth. Denmark, Japan, I think elsewhere. I think it might be. I can't remember if there's another country there or not. But we've slipped down the ranking. The only reason we've done as well as we have is because we're a windy island in the North Sea, where we are ideally placed to benefit from wind, not for any big strategic reason. We cut the solar feed-in tariffs as well. David Cameron famously said, cut the green crap in 2013, and we went from 2 million homes a year being insulated to tens of thousands most recently. And this just is not the way to plan. And I don't know whether that's risk appetite or something else, but it's a withdrawal of government and the public sector from crucial areas of opportunity and investment in the infrastructure of the country as a whole. And I think that government has a fundamental role alongside businesses, as I've been saying. And I think we have to, I think government's role, actually, as much as anything, is to, in crowding in private money, it is to act as the guarantor, to give the certainty, the long-term confidence. So our plan for installation of homes, for example, is a 10-year plan. That gives the industry the ability to say, we can gear up, we can recruit, we can train, we can invest in our businesses to deliver the 2 million homes a year that we envisage as part of that plan. And that's the kind of role, I think, for government, where it's a balanced risk, actually, because you can make a business case, and this is really what business does, isn't it? You make the case, you put together your business plan, and you say that's got a good chance of succeeding. And for me, there's a role to play in the public sector in a similar way as investors do in the private sector, of saying, look, for an effective industrial strategy, we've got to look at a range of technologies. Because right now, to your point about hydrogen, Ollie, we don't know which technologies are going to come to the fore. We don't know what the balance of different technologies is going to be in the transition to low carbon. So government's role has got to be to encourage and attract the private investment across a range of these technologies. That applies for infrastructure. It applies to the technologies directly and the companies. I think that's where we will get the success.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Bill. Steve Avashi, if you want to make any small additions to your other...
I shall have to say goodbye to you now, because that's the bell to vote going on in the background.
Bill.
Okay, I think on risk appetite, it's really, really important to address that, because it's not efficient the way that often government procurement works. And I would mention an example of alliancing. Alliancing, we're doing it in prisons, sort of doing it potentially in healthcare and education. And that is bringing contractors together to work at the most efficient solution, sharing knowledge, looking at sort of efficiencies around a common platform, and sort of looking in a different way about risk appetite and risk allocation, and perhaps in a more strategic way. It's what the construction playbook was looking for. It's what that is driving at, is that early engagement, that efficiency around how we bring, you know, private sector and public sector in this case together to make the most efficient and responsible decisions. I think that's really, really important. And then obviously that links in with planning as well, because if we can get the planning system working more efficiently, clearer allocation around that, and more systems-based approach to planning, more control around what goes on locally, with efficient approaches to how we bring some standardisation and efficiency, because we need these assets as a country. We need to make them as efficiently as possible and not go reinventing the wheel every time and building inefficient localised solutions that are always different, that end up costing the taxpayer lots of money. So it's around that efficiency approach, and bringing in that sort of local decision-based approach to decision making as well. I think that's really important.
Excellent.
And I just want to say in 1 minute that that is precisely what an institution such as ours is designed to do, because we have to not just show that we are making a positive financial return, but also hit our strategic objectives. We are designed to have a higher risk appetite. We can offer concessional financing, preferential rates. You can, go into partnerships with government. So, the institutional capital of UKIB is also an important feature in delivering, higher risk appetite for, government investment, public investment.
Excellent. Thanks very much. I can possibly squeeze one more question in, if anyone in the audience has one.
Hi, I'm Iran. I represent TfL and just infrastructure and architecture geek. I have a question. I'll just broadly address to the board. Are we looking to invest in training and retraining of professionals who will be slowly released from traditional services industry to feed the supply chain to help transition? Because for context, I'm asking the question because there's not enough consultants, there's not enough consultants around who are able to suggest the best possible solutions for retrofitting, for transitioning, to bringing the load of electricity generation. It would be great if say, a representative of Labour government would respond if they have a clear plan on retraining and training new professionals.
That is a very good question, and one that I plan to ask myself, so thank you very much. So on the link between infrastructure and other areas of government policy, including skills, I'm going to go around starting with Sir John, and fold in any closing remarks that you want to make as well. Thanks.
I believe skills and training is fundamentally the responsibility of employers. I don't believe it's the responsibility of government. And I think one of the weaknesses of this country is that there is underinvestment by employers in training. I saw a figure a couple of days ago, I think it was only something like, it was either 17 or 27% of employers are actually directly investing in training. And I think, but what we have to do is create the need for that training. which comes back to this certainty and of policy and delivery, which actually can enable companies to see that there's going to be a demand for their services. If it's an employer, you can see there's a demand for your services, then you'll go and start recruiting and training, whether it's from overseas, from whether it's the UK, it doesn't matter, frankly, in my mind. The important thing is that you create jobs, because jobs drives economic growth. But I don't think we can have some sort of centralized, grand sort of Soviet plan which says, oh, well, in the Northwest, we're going to need 300 of these, and over there, we're going to need 100, and over here, we're going to have 500, and then start saying to education bodies, this is what you've got to do to deliver. It has to be done as a consequence of demands, not trying to predict what the demand is going to be and then sort of lay out and waste money probably on training the wrong skills for the wrong jobs. So I think you've got to have that certainty of demand, which comes back to our earlier conversation, but then you will see the reaction of employers. If we had absolute certainty about the programme of the rollout of heat pumps and the insulation of homes, that is the biggest driver of local growth than anything else, because it's across the whole country that we'll have to invest in these activities. It'll require skills across the whole country, and you will see people retraining voluntarily in order to get on that ladder, because they can see 10 years of work installing heat pumps or carrying out thermal efficiency improvements, whatever it might be. And I was delighted to hear the government actually yesterday acknowledging that it was going to start being willing to bring back skilled workers from overseas, because clearly that has created a hole in the availability of labour as well.
Excellent. Thanks very much. So, Steve, I mean, does the uncertainty and instability in public sector project pipeline affect decisions Waite makes around training?
I think it's really, really important. This pipeline, as I mentioned earlier, the long-term pipeline, that certainty around where we're going to get the work from in 3 years, 5 years' time plus, is really, really important in making those investment decisions. And I think that there's an important point to make around this thing around the skills crisis as well, because it isn't just operatives, it's also professionals, skilled professionals doing design work, etc. There is a huge problem around the availability of designers as well. And I'll give you an example as well. We're again talking about the World Platform, working on a large-scale project where the team have been moved off to work on a design for a job in Saudi because they're mobile, because of modern techniques. You can use the same design team all around the world because they can work virtually. So we've got these other challenges where people are going off to go and work on other schemes. So we need to be quite cognizant of these sort of different challenges. We do need to train those people. But one of the issues we have, we train about 40,000 people per annum in construction-related disciplines, but there's only 8,000 jobs for them. We've got to think about how we give these young people a future with a job attached to it. It is no good just continuing just to put them through university, put them through college, if there isn't an actual job for them to do. Because that's one of the challenges that we face. Then they're going into other industries and other things. So I think absolutely that commitment to training, and I think across the industry we need to improve cross-working. CITB needs to continue to improve and progress as well. It's all part of the industry, and we've really got to address that. It's absolutely critical. But that pipeline is really important.
Excellent. Thanks very much. I'm afraid our MP scarpered shortly before you asked for a policy commitment, so it's going to be straight to Avashi on that question, or any other sort of general closing.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to add to the excellent comments made on skills. That's not, I'm going to profess I'm in that expert area. But I think it's really important, as I said before, for us and for any institutions, including the NIC, to be hand in glove with, what central government is doing. So we are operationally independent, but we are partners with government. We are not going to just stand aside. We are a problem-solving institution. We are going to talk to them, and that's what we are doing. We are in regular dialogue with them, and issues such as skills, planning, what we heard earlier about hydrogen, because that's one of our sectors. we have to understand how the pipeline is and would develop, where we can come in, because we are in a sweet spot between the market and the government. Are we hitting that sweet spot? And where are we going to come in and support technology? So, all I wanted to say was that, that partnership and dialogue is also quite critical to, solving some of the problems that we've been talking about.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So that brings everything to a close for today, I think. I'd like to thank Waits again for partnering with us to deliver this event. Thanks very much to everyone in the room and indeed to everyone online for joining us. I hope you found it interesting. A reminder that our next public event asks the question, is the Darlington Economic Campus a blueprint for successful civil service relocation? We will be holding that in Darlington on the Economic Campus, but you can sign up to join online. That's Monday lunchtime. But other than that, feel free to join us for drinks on the landing immediately after this. But I hope you'll join me in thanking Avashi, Bill, Steve and John for a fascinating discussion.